The sharp, tinkling laughter cut through the hushed, anticipatory silence of the solicitor's waiting room, and it was aimed directly at my feet. My shoes, plain, dark gray, almost orthopedic-looking loafers I'd found at the back of the St. Jude's Hospice shop for £3.50. They were comfortable, practical, and, crucially, all I could afford as I navigated the financial wreckage Mark, my soon-to-be ex-husband, had deliberately created. He sat opposite me, impeccably dressed in a suit that probably cost more than my entire wardrobe for the last 5 years, a smug little smile playing on his lips. Beside him, Chloe, his new, much younger partner, wasn't even trying to hide her amusement. Her perfectly manicured hand, adorned with a diamond that mocked the simple gold band I still wore out of habit, flew to her glossy lips as she giggled. "Darling," she whispered to Mark loud enough for me to hear, "are those actual orthotics? How terribly quaint." Mark just shrugged, a picture of feigned indifference that barely masked his cruel satisfaction. 45 years old, and here I was, Sarah Matthews, being openly mocked for my footwear by the man I'd shared 2 decades of my life with and the woman he'd replaced me with. The humiliation was a physical heat that crept up my neck, but beneath it, a cold, hard knot of resolve began to form. This meeting was supposed to be a final attempt to mediate the division of assets before heading to court, the main point of contention being our family home, the home I'd poured my heart and soul into, the home where I'd raised our children, the home Mark now wanted to sell to fund his lavish new life with Chloe. They thought these shoes, this thrift store reality, meant I was broken, defeated, that I'd just roll over. They underestimated the steel that years of quiet sacrifices and his recent betrayals had forged within me. This isn't just a story about a pair of shoes or even a house. It's about finding your footing when the world tries to trip you, about realizing that true value isn't measured in designer labels or bank balances, but in the quiet resilience of the human spirit. They laughed then, but I knew with a certainty that settled deep in my bones that I would have the last word. The solicitor's heavy oak door closed behind me, and the sound of their receding laughter, still faintly echoing in my ears, felt like a brand. I walked out into the gray afternoon, the worn soles of my charity shop shoes surprisingly steady on the pavement. Isolation pressed in, a familiar companion these past few months. Mark had been systematic in cutting me off, not just financially, but socially too. Our friends had quickly taken sides, mostly his, drawn to his continued affluence and charismatic denials. My calls to him to discuss a fair settlement had gone unanswered, or worse, were met with Chloe's saccharine voice telling me Mark was terribly busy. The contrast between the life I'd painstakingly built, the comfortable home, the shared dreams, the illusion of partnership, and this stark new reality of impending homelessness and public ridicule was a chasm I was struggling to bridge. Fear was a constant, cold knot in my stomach. The house wasn't just bricks and mortar. It was my sanctuary, the repository of my life's happiest and most challenging memories. It was where I'd nursed fevers, celebrated birthdays, and quietly wept through Mark's growing indifference. The thought of Chloe flitting through those rooms, redecorating with her expensive, shallow taste, was a violation I couldn't bear. That evening, alone in the half-empty house, Mark had already taken most of the valuable art and furniture. I sat at the kitchen table, a pile of confusing legal documents spread before me. The sheer injustice of it all threatened to overwhelm me, He'd earned more, yes, but I'd enabled that by sacrificing my own career as a graphic designer, by managing the household, raising the children, by being the unpaid, unacknowledged support system for his ambition. Now, he argued, my contributions were negligible. I could have walked away, accepted his paltry offer, found a tiny flat somewhere, and tried to rebuild. It would have been easier, less confrontational. But then I looked down at my sensible second-hand shoes. They weren't a symbol of defeat. They were a symbol of resourcefulness, of making do, of quiet strength. And in them, I decided I would stand my ground. I found an old piggy bank, one I'd used to save for a rainy day, a habit my thrifty mother had instilled in me. It wasn't much, but it was mine. The next morning, I took that money, every last coin, and made an appointment with a solicitor who specialized in family law, someone reputed to be a fighter. It was a huge gamble, but the alternative, surrendering my home and my dignity, was unthinkable. The journey into the legal world felt like stepping into a dense, fog-filled forest. Everything was unfamiliar, the language obtuse, the procedures labyrinthine. My first meeting with Miss Evans, the solicitor, took place in a small, cluttered office that smelled of old books and strong coffee. She was a woman in her late 50s, with sharp eyes and a no-nonsense demeanor that I found oddly comforting after Mark and Chloe's slick condescension. I explained my situation, my voice trembling slightly as I recounted their laughter at my shoes, the casual cruelty of their remarks. Miss Evans listened intently, her expression unreadable. When I finished, she looked down at my feet, then back at my face. "Good, sturdy shoes, Mrs. Matthews," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "You'll need them. This won't be an easy path, especially if your ex-husband is determined to be difficult, and it sounds like he is." The initial challenges were immense, sifting through years of financial records, trying to prove my non-financial contributions to the marriage, facing the condescending tone of Mark's solicitor's letters. It was emotionally draining. There were days I felt utterly overwhelmed, sitting alone in the quiet house, the silence amplifying my anxieties. The legal fees mounted, even with Miss Evans trying to keep costs down. I took on extra freelance work, tiny graphic design jobs for local businesses, working late into the night, fueled by lukewarm tea and sheer determination. My world shrank to the parameters of the case, documents, deadlines, and the looming court date. I was often at my lowest point during those months, exhausted, financially stretched to breaking point, and terrified of the outcome. The weight of what I stood to lose pressed down on me. Sometimes late at night, I'd walk through the familiar rooms of my house, touching the walls, the worn banister, imprinting the feel of it into my memory, just in case. But each time despair threatened to engulf me, I'd remember that tinkling, cruel laughter, and I'd put on my £3.50 shoes, symbols of my current reality, but also of my refusal to be crushed and get back to work. The path was treacherous, but my sensible shoes and the growing resolve they represented kept me moving forward, one steady step at a time. There was a particularly bleak week in late autumn. A letter had arrived from Mark's solicitor, a ridiculously low settlement offer disguised as a generous gesture, filled with veiled threats about the costs if I proceeded to court. Doubt, cold and insidious, began to creep in. Was I being foolish? Was I just prolonging the agony? I sat at my kitchen table, head in my hands, the letter crumpled beside me, feeling the fight drain out of me. Just as I was contemplating calling Miss Evans to concede, my phone rang. It was an old friend, Clara, someone I'd lost touch with after Mark had decided she wasn't sophisticated enough for our social circle. She'd heard through the grapevine about my struggles and had tracked down my number. "Sarah," she said, her voice warm and familiar, "I heard you're going through it. Don't you dare let that weasel grind you down. You've got more grit in your little finger than he has in his whole bespoke-suited body." Her unexpected call, her unwavering belief in me, was like a lifeline thrown into a stormy sea. She insisted on coming over, bringing with her a casserole and a bottle of cheap, cheerful wine. We talked for hours that evening, Clara listening patiently as I poured out my fears and frustrations. She didn't offer easy platitudes, but practical advice and fierce encouragement. She also mentioned her cousin, a retired accountant who sometimes did forensic work for legal cases on a pro bono basis if he felt the cause was just. "Let me talk to him," Clara said. "No promises, but he's a whiz with numbers and has a soft spot for an underdog." A few days later, Clara's cousin, Mr. Henderson, a quiet, meticulous man with kind eyes behind thick glasses, agreed to look over my financial records. He spent hours in my dining room, surrounded by bank statements and receipts, asking precise, insightful questions. Miss Evans, initially skeptical of amateur help, was quickly impressed by his thoroughness. Finding these allies, Clara with her unwavering friendship and Mr. Henderson with his unexpected expertise, was a turning point. It wasn't just their practical help, it was the feeling of not being alone anymore, of having people in my corner who saw past the thrift store shoes and the messy divorce to the woman underneath. Their support created a small sanctuary of hope in the midst of the legal storm. I wasn't just fighting for a house anymore. I was fighting with the backing of people who believed in justice and in me. The temporary safety they offered wasn't a guarantee of winning, but it was the courage to continue the fight. The work intensified. Mr. Henderson, with his quiet diligence, began to unearth discrepancies in Mark's financial disclosures, subtle movements of funds, assets undervalued or conveniently omitted. He worked closely with Miss Evans, and I became an active participant in my own defense, a role I hadn't anticipated. I spent hours with them, learning to decipher financial jargon, cross-referencing statements, and recalling details about past expenditures and investments that I'd long forgotten. My old graphic design skills even came into play, creating clear charts and timelines from complex financial data that helped illustrate Mark's attempts to hide marital assets. It was challenging, painstaking work. My fingers were often stained with ink, my eyes tired from staring at spreadsheets, but with each small discovery, with each piece of the puzzle that Mr. Henderson patiently explained, my understanding grew, and so did my confidence. Miss Evans, seeing my dedication, started treating me less like a fragile victim and more like a capable partner in the case. "You have a good head for this, Sarah," she remarked one afternoon after I'd pointed out a pattern in Mark's spending around the time he'd met Chloe. "Most clients just want us to wave a magic wand." Her words were a small validation, but they meant the world. The thrift store shoes became a private symbol. I wore them every day as I worked on the case, a reminder of where I was, but also of how far I was determined to go. They grounded me, kept me focused on the substance, not the superficialities that Mark and Chloe valued so highly. There were no more tears of despair, only a focused, quiet anger that fueled my efforts. I was no longer just reacting to Mark's machinations. I was actively building my defense, brick by painstaking brick. The fear didn't disappear entirely, but it was now overshadowed by a sense of purpose, a growing belief that truth, if meticulously unearthed, could prevail. This intense period of learning and adaptation, of diving headfirst into the complexities of my own case, was transforming me. I was shedding the skin of the overlooked, underestimated wife and stepping into the role of a resilient, resourceful woman fighting for her due. The meticulous work started to bear fruit, and with it, my integration into this new world of legal strategy and self-advocacy deepened. Mr. Henderson, bless his unassuming heart, uncovered a significant offshore account Mark had failed to declare, one he'd clearly been siphoning funds into for years, likely in preparation for this very eventuality. It was the kind of discovery that could change the entire complexion of the case. Ms. Evans was professionally jubilant, her sharp eyes gleaming with the thrill of the legal hunt. "This, Sarah," she said, tapping the damning bank statement, "this is what we call a game changer." The support from Clara remained unwavering. She'd call regularly, not just to check on the case, but to check on me, reminding me to eat, to rest, to take a walk by the river. She even organized a small fighting fund among a few old friends, a gesture that brought tears to my eyes, less for the modest sum raised and more for the incredible solidarity it represented. These were people Mark had dismissed, yet here they were, offering tangible support in my hour of need. Their belief in me, in my fight for fairness, boosted my confidence immeasurably. It was a stark contrast to the dismissive, materialistic world Mark and Chloe inhabited, where value was measured in brand names and bank balances. Here, in this small circle of support, value was measured in loyalty, integrity, and the courage to stand up for what was right. I even found a small online forum for women going through contentious divorces, a place where I could share my experiences anonymously and receive practical advice and emotional support from others who understood the battlefield. It was a revelation to realize I wasn't alone in this specific type of struggle. Participating, even just reading others' stories of resilience, made me feel part of a larger, unseen community of women finding their strength. The validation of my efforts, the growing strength of the evidence, and the unwavering support of my allies solidified my resolve. The woman who had been mocked for her shoes was now armed with facts, backed by friends, and ready to face whatever came next. The house was still the goal, but the fight had become about something more, reclaiming my dignity and proving my worth, not just to Mark, but to myself. The discovery of Mark's undeclared offshore account was the turning point. Suddenly, the ground beneath Mark's carefully constructed facade of financial probity began to tremble. Ms. Evans informed his solicitor of our findings, and the arrogant tenor of their correspondence shifted almost overnight. There was a new, almost panicked edge to their communications. For the first time, I felt a flicker of genuine power, the kind that comes not from wealth or status, but from holding the irrefutable truth. I realized my self-worth was not, and had never been, tied to Mark's approval or the lifestyle he provided. It resided in my own resilience, my integrity, and my capacity to fight for what was just. The impending court date, once a source of immense dread, now felt like an opportunity, a stage upon which the truth could finally be revealed. I spent hours with Miss Evans, preparing my testimony, going over potential questions. She coached me to remain calm, to speak clearly, to focus on the facts. My old passion for graphic design, long dormant, resurfaced with a new purpose. I meticulously organized the evidence into clear, compelling visual aids. Charts showing the flow of money into the hidden account, timelines highlighting Mark's deception coinciding with the start of his affair with Chloe. It felt good to use my skills again, not for some corporate logo, but for my own liberation. I started to envision a future beyond the court case, a future where I was secure in my home, perhaps even slowly rebuilding my design career. The vision was still hazy, but for the first time in months, it was tinged with hope rather than fear. I even bought a new pair of shoes for court, not expensive, but smart, comfortable black heels from a department store sale. The thrift store loafers, however, I kept. They were a reminder of my journey, of the humility and strength I'd found when I had little else. They represented the woman who had been laughed at but who had refused to be broken. As the court date approached, I felt a calm resolve settle over me. The fight was far from over, but I was no longer the terrified, humiliated woman from that solicitor's office. I was Sarah Matthews, prepared, supported, and ready to claim what was rightfully mine. The news of our discovery clearly rattled Mark. A few days before the scheduled court hearing, an urgent message arrived from his solicitor proposing a new settlement. It was significantly better than their previous derisory offers, even conceding that I could keep the house if I dropped any claim on the offshore funds and agreed to a stringent non-disclosure agreement. Miss Evans presented it to me neutrally, but her raised eyebrow told me what she thought. "They're scared, Sarah," she said. "This is a panic move. They know what that offshore account looks like in court, premeditated financial deception." The offer was tempting. It would mean an end to the stress, the uncertainty. I could keep my home. But then I thought of the laughter, the calculated cruelty, the years he'd spent undermining me, and now this attempt to buy my silence, to sweep his deceit under the rug. I thought of Chloe smirking in her designer clothes. This wasn't just about the money or even the house anymore. It was about accountability. "No," I told Miss Evans, my voice firm. "We proceed to court. I want it all out in the open." She smiled, a genuine, admiring smile. "I was hoping you'd say that." The days leading up to the hearing were a blur of final preparations. I went over my financial charts, rehearsed my testimony, and tried to mentally prepare for the confrontation. The threat from Mark, his attempt to control the narrative with a last-minute offer, felt less potent now. I had faced my fear of him, of his power, and found it wanting. My allies, Clara and Mr. Henderson, were my rocks. Clara helped me choose a simple, dignified outfit for court, a navy blue dress that made me feel professional and strong. Mr. Henderson reviewed our financial summaries one last time, giving me a quiet nod of encouragement. On the eve of the court date, I took out the gray thrift store loafers. I wouldn't wear them to court, but I held them for a moment, acknowledging their role in my journey. They represented the starting point, the moment of raw humiliation that had ignited this fight. Tomorrow, I would walk into that courtroom with a different kind of confidence, one built not on expensive accessories, but on hard-won self-assurance and the unshakable power of the truth. The past, with its mockery and betrayal, was about to meet the present, and I was ready. The courtroom was intimidating, all polished wood and hushed solemnity. Mark and Chloe were already there, seated with their barrister. Mark looked pale and strained beneath his expensive tailoring. Chloe, for once, wasn't smirking but fidgeting with a pearl necklace, her gaze darting nervously around. I took my place beside Miss Evans, my heart pounding but my hands steady in my lap. I wore my new sensible heels, but in my mind I felt the grounding presence of those old thrift store loafers. Miss Evans presented our case with calm, incisive clarity. She laid out the history of the marriage, my contributions, both financial and non-financial, and then, with devastating precision, she detailed Mark's attempts to deceive the court, culminating in the evidence of the undeclared offshore account. The charts I had prepared were displayed, stark and undeniable. When it was my turn to speak, to answer questions, I focused on Miss Evans' advice. Speak clearly, stick to the facts. I looked directly at the judge, avoiding Mark's gaze. I spoke of my role in building our life together, the sacrifices I'd made, and the shock of discovering his betrayal, both personal and financial. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't weep. I simply told my truth. Mark's barrister tried to paint me as bitter, vindictive, exaggerating my contributions. But under Mrs. Evans' skilled cross-examination, Mark himself stumbled, contradicted his own statements, his carefully constructed image crumbling under pressure. Chloe looked increasingly aghast. The moment the judge began to deliver her summary and ruling felt like an eternity. She spoke of the sanctity of marital partnership, of the expectation of honesty in financial disclosures. She was scathing about Mark's deliberate attempt to hide assets. And then, the words I had fought so hard to hear. It is the ruling of this court that the matrimonial home be transferred solely to Mrs. Matthews. Furthermore, a significant portion of the undeclared offshore assets will be awarded to Mrs. Matthews to ensure a fair and equitable division. A gasp escaped Chloe. Mark slumped in his chair, his face ashen. I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled my knees. Miss Evans squeezed my arm. The laughter that had echoed in my ears for months was finally, definitively silenced, replaced by the quiet, authoritative voice of justice. I had walked into that courtroom, a woman once scorned for her shoes, and I was about to walk out with my home, my dignity, and my future secured. Mark and Chloe hurried out of the courtroom, their faces a mixture of shock and subdued fury, avoiding eye contact with anyone. There were no more sneers, no more condescending smiles, only the stark reality of their defeat. Miss Evans and I gathered our papers, a quiet sense of triumph shared between us. As I stepped out of the courthouse and into the unexpected sunshine, I took a deep breath. The air felt cleaner, lighter. Clara was waiting for me at the bottom of the steps, her face wreathed in a triumphant grin. She enveloped me in a huge hug. "You did it, Sarah. You actually did it," she exclaimed, her voice thick with emotion. That evening, I walked back into my house. It felt different, truly mine in a way it hadn't before. The lingering shadows of Mark's presence, his control, seemed to have lifted. I wandered from room to room, a quiet joy settling in my heart. Later, I made myself a cup of tea and sat in my favorite armchair, looking out at the garden I had nurtured for so many years. The journey had been brutal, born from betrayal and humiliation. Yet, in the crucible of that fight, I had discovered a strength I never knew I possessed. Mark's cruelty, his laughter at my thrift store shoes, had inadvertently been the catalyst for my transformation. pushing me to fight not just for a house, but for my own self-worth. Those humble shoes, a symbol of my lowest point, had carried me on a path to empowerment. They now sat in my wardrobe, not as a relic of shame, but as a proud reminder of resilience, of the unexpected kindness of allies, and of the quiet power of standing firm in your own truth, no matter how battered your souls may be. The future felt open, full of possibilities. Perhaps I would restart my design business, on my own terms this time. Perhaps I would simply enjoy the peace of my home. Whatever came next, I knew I would face it with the quiet confidence of a woman who had faced down scorn and deceit, and had walked away owning not just her house but herself.